Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is episode 2 in my series where I am working my way through 101 horror books to read before you're murdered by Sadie Hartmann, aka Mother Horror. I recently did the haunted houses section in this book and I had a lot of fun. I read 3 very different takes on the haunted houses genre and I really ended up loving 2 of them. One of them, not my cup of tea, but it still was a really fun reading experience. So we are continuing on with this vlog challenge, episode 2, like I mentioned before at the end of the last episode. Because I am using my library to get these books, we're just jumping around throughout this book. This book has divided up the horror book recommendations into subcategories. I'm just jumping around section to section as my library gets in these books and they become available to me. So in this vlog, we are covering the demons and possession section. This section opens up with a quote from William Peter Blatty, author of The Exorcist. "As far as God goes, I am a non-believer, still am. But when it comes to a devil, well, that's something else." There are 4 books recommended in this section and I have already read 2 of them, so I'm going to quickly talk about those. The first book mentioned is Boys in the Valley by Philip Fracassi, and this book came out, well, first it was traditionally published before then, but Tor Nightfire picked it up, published it last year, and I read this one and I have a very unpopular opinion. Now, a lot of people say that this is the scariest exorcism book that they have read since The Exorcist. I think that I went into that just really with wild expectations for this book, and I do wish that I would have read this physically rather than listened to the audiobook just because of personal preference. So I did not love this one. I understand why people do and I understand why it's on here. It's a coming-of-age possession horror that features a very snowy, isolated setting and it takes place at an orphanage for boys. This one is one where I would recommend it if you really enjoy demon and possession horror, because I know that I am in the minority for not having loved it. The other book that was recommended that I've already read is Come Closer by Sarah Gran. This came out in 2003 and I absolutely loved this one. I thought it was just so eerie and unsettling. It's a shorter book and you can really fly through it and it's just very unsettling. We're following a woman as she starts to feel like maybe something's a little bit off and maybe goes down this rabbit hole, this mental rabbit hole of being possessed. I really enjoyed it. So both of these recommendations totally get why they're on there. So that leaves us with 2 books for this vlog that I have not read yet. So for this vlog, we'll be reading The Demonologist by Andrew Pyper. This came out in 2013. It has to deal with Paradise Lost, the story, and a demonologist, as the title suggests. The next book recommended that I'm going to be picking up is The Wicked by James Newman. This came out in 2007. The cover, super vintage. I love the vibe and the aesthetic of this cover. It's a small town horror, which I tend to really love. And then I went ahead and added a book to this TBR. So we're a little bit deviating from 101 horror books to read before you're murdered, but I just like personal preference having vlogs with at least 3 books. So because I have 2 books taken from the recommendations, I've already read the other 2, I decided to go with the blurb that kicked off this section of the book. Now, I have already read The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. Highly recommend you listen to the audiobook. It is a classic. It holds up. It's super creepy and I hate it and I love it because it's very unsettling. So I figured for the 3rd and final book in the series, let's just pick up Legion by William Peter Blatty. This is the sequel to The Exorcist. This is actually what The Exorcist 3, I believe, was based on. I've seen that movie. I've really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot more than 2. So this is going to be the 3rd book that we are reading for this vlog. So I am really excited. We're gonna have a fun week full of demonic and possession horror. I'm going to go ahead and start off this vlog with the first book, which is The Demonologist by Andrew Pyper. Mother Horror says about The Demonologist: the basics. Professor David Ullman is an expert on the poem Paradise Lost by John Milton, which follows the Genesis origin story in the Bible. David has suffered a lot of trauma and tragedy in his life. He battles depression and his marriage is falling apart. A mysterious woman presents David with a strange quest of sorts: travel to Italy and lend his expertise to a situation going on there. David brings his daughter Tess and things take a very dark turn. Mother Horror says Andrew Pyper knows how to take his readers on an inescapable journey rife with personal nightmares. I knew the risk of real terror was high based on how emotionally invested I was. This one lingers. I'm going to go read that, check back in at the 50% mark, and let y'all know how I'm feeling. So without further ado, let's go ahead and read about some possessions. Okay, so I have made it through 50% of the Demonologist, and I really do not know how I feel about this book. It's a very interesting reading experience, that's for sure. One of the blurbs on the back of this book says that this book is the Exorcist meets the Da Vinci Code, and while I can see that because we are following a college professor as he investigates, he's invited to investigate this very strange phenomenon, so I can see those comp titles. However, I love both the Exorcist and the Da Vinci Code, and this is not really grabbing me, at least not in the first 50% in the way either of those books or movies, to be honest, has done. But I am really intrigued about the story. I really tend to enjoy stories where we follow a college professor and they have some really niche area of expertise and they get drawn into either uncovering a mystery or a conspiracy like the Da Vinci Code. I'm also thinking kind of a Discovery of Witches does that too. Now, for a Discovery of Witches, I love the first one, did not like the second one, have not read the third, so I don't know, but I love the Dan Brown series. I love the Da Vinci Code series, but this is also a premise that can also go really wrong for me at times. In particular, I'm thinking of The Historian. That was a book that follows a similar premise to the Da Vinci Code. It's kind of marketed a lot as the Da Vinci Code with vampires, and that on paper is a 5-star read for me, like in theory, but I did not end up enjoying that book, so it really could go either way for me. I'm enjoying the story. I'm really not loving our protagonist. I think he's very, very pretentious, and in particular, like if you've been to college, think of the most pretentious professor that you had. And that's our main character. And it's a certain type of pretentious character because you could be the best in the world at something, whether it's in real life or in a book, and just not have this like air of superiority about you at all times. Our main character's internal monologue really is driving me up a wall. He's not pleasant. I don't think I would enjoy having a conversation with him, but that's not really like the premise of this book, so I'm never going to meet our main character, but it's a little bit grating, in particular because I have read books like the Da Vinci Code where our main character is super smart and a genius and like the best of the best in what he does, but he doesn't like translate that into the whole entire world. In particular, the most egregious is like the comments about mental health and depression and what depression is. Newsflash, it's not just loneliness. I think there's a conversation to be had about how our society perpetuates this epidemic of loneliness and how we're not as connected as a community and how that can impact and influence depression. But you know, sometimes it's just a chemical imbalance in your brain, or not if you are our main character. Just his views on depression make me nervous reading this one because I really love demonic possession. I love possession tales and I love this subgenre, but I hate when mental illness is exploited as a plot point, and I especially hate when mental illness is not just used as a is it demonic possession or is it mental illness, but it goes a next step further and say mental illness is demonic possession. possession. So I'm like strangely worried that that is like where this book is going. I wouldn't think that this is where this book is going, but the main character's internal monologue is just a little insufferable, but the journey and the setup and him kind of going on this journey both physically and mentally and spiritually a little bit is very interesting. I think it's really fascinating. His area of expertise, he is a scholar with Milton's Paradise Lost, and that epic work, I've actually never read it, but I'm like familiar with those concepts in that story. So it's very interesting that he's actually an atheist and he has spent his life and his career building up his reputation as a scholar of Paradise Lost. And so when this story starts becoming very relevant to this mystery and to his life and threatening both him and his daughter, he has to figure out like what all is going on here and what strange occurrences are happening. Are they perhaps demonic? So I love the premise of this one. I'm not so sure about the execution. I'm also shocked at how short this one is. I think seeing it compared to The Historian and the Da Vinci Code made me think that this was a longer book than it was, because those are both, I think, like 400-ish pages. This one I think is less than 300. I'm reading an ebook, but I think I saw on Storygraph that the physical book is less than 300 pages. Yeah, it's 285. So I think this is like going to be very fast paced, and I'm at the 50% mark, and I'm very curious to see where we go from here. There have been some chilling moments. We'll see what wins out for me in the end, because there's a lot to like. There's a lot that I'm not particularly a fan of when it comes to this one, but either way, I'm really invested in this one and I'm very curious to see how it ends. So I am going to go ahead and finish this one up, and I will let y'all know my final thoughts. Okay, so a little bit of a change in location than what you're normally used to. I am on vacation, but I did finish The Demonologist and wanted to come on and give some of my thoughts while it was still fresh in my mind. I read the second half of this book in the car, and I think that may be like a really good way to read this one, whether you read it physically or read it as an audiobook, like when you're traveling, because I think this could be like a really good traveling story, which is something that I didn't love. I didn't love the way this was executed. I thought the premise of this one was so intriguing, and I really thought that I would love this one, it being compared to books that I had loved before, like the Dan Brown books. I would say this one is for the plot-driven readers. If you prefer a plot-driven over a character-driven story, I think you'll like this one more than I did. I really enjoyed, again, like the concept and what was going on. I love when we have a professor and they are going on a journey, or they have to solve this mystery, or they get entangled with something that has to deal with their area of expertise. This just didn't work for me, unfortunately. There were some moments in here. I think this would be a good introduction for people looking to get into horror, because like The Exorcist is genuinely like one of the scariest books that I have read. This one, even though it deals with similar themes of demonic possession, I think this one isn't as, like, there are some spooky scenes in here, but this one does not go like as far as The Exorcist does in terms of fear factor. So I think this could be a good one if you maybe are interested in reading The Exorcist and you want to work your way up. And then of course, if you want something that's like shorter and speedier, I just wished this one was slower and more character driven, because I love when we're reading this type of book and we spend such a long time going down research rabbit holes and researching and going to talk to different people and getting like big pieces of history and information that may seem info dumpy, but like I think the Dan Brown series does it really well, how they are getting history explained to them, or like uncovering things that like don't match up, and like research montages. I really enjoy those kind of scenes, and the scenes in here felt very short. I also felt, this is like a little bit nitpicky, but this came out in 2013 and I felt like this book wanted to be written or wanted to take place in the 80s or 90s, with the references to technology and the way our main character like just referenced technology. It felt super dated, but not in like an inappropriate manner. It brought up things that I remember 2013, and things like payphones and the attitudes towards technology that this professor has, and just how technology is used, how the iPhone was used, how different communications and just technology in general. I think that the author probably wanted to not have a lot of technology, so he could have written it in the 80s or 90s and taken out like those iPhone references and things, and maybe that would have like worked a little bit more cohesively. In particular, in the biggest research scene in here, the professor is talking about Google, and the way that he's describing Google is not like how Google works, and just the attitude of this professor towards Google and academic research, and even just research in general, feels like he should be like a 70-year-old man as opposed to, I think he's in his 30s or 40s. So I think if this had been longer and more character driven, then I would have really enjoyed it, as well as I felt like the end of this one, and I noticed this on the positive reviews as well, the ending felt a little abrupt. However, due to the way this story was paced and the way that it does feel like a road trip story at times, I think this would be great if you need like a speedier, faster audiobook to listen to, like if you have a long car drive, because the travel nature, and there's enough different locations where I feel like it would be a good book for that, where you would break up your time on the trip as the character is going to different locations. My favorite location was in the very beginning of this book when he goes to Venice with his daughter. I thought that was so cool. I wanted more of it. But yeah, overall, I see the appeal that this would have for people who are plot driven over character driven, who want something speedy, who want something more like maybe thrillery paced, and don't want like a slow creeping horror. So that's who I would recommend this book to, and I'm looking forward to checking out the next book. The next book's actually at home, so you'll see me in just a second as I introduce this next book in the vlog at home. And we're back. The next book that I'm going to be picking up for this vlog is Legion by William Peter Blatty. Now, even though Legion is not recommended in 101 horror books to read before you're murdered, Mother Horror does talk about William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. She says that The Exorcist scared the bejesus out of me. I loved it. It was a spiritual experience, igniting my insatiable appetite for demon possession books. Legion is the sequel to The Exorcist. It involves demonic possession. It mixes horror and a police detective whodunit. We're following a detective who investigates a series of murders that all have the hallmarks of a long-dead serial killer who was shot by police and the body never recovered. This 1983 book was adapted for the film The Exorcist 3 in 1990, and Blatty based aspects of the Gemini killer in this book on the real-life Zodiac killer, who actually in a January 1974 letter to the San Francisco Chronicle praised the original Exorcist film as the best satirical comedy that he has ever seen. So I am 50% of the way through Legion, and I'm definitely enjoying it a lot more than the last book I read for this vlog, which is a relief. I kind of knew going into this one, well, I didn't know, but I had a feeling going into this one that I would enjoy it because I've seen The Exorcist 3, which is the adaptation of this book, and I really enjoyed the movie. So, you know, typically the books tend to be better, so I had a good feeling about going into this one, and I'm enjoying it so far. This one is not as good as The Exorcist. I mean, I think few sequels really live up to like their predecessors, but The Exorcist book and movie are both very solid for me. However, I really love The Exorcist 3 as well, so I'm not hating this one. It definitely doesn't have like the immediate magic of The Exorcist did for me, but I'm enjoying it, and I also think it's because I'm in the mood for this type of story, because as I am filming this, Longlegs has just come out in theaters, and I've also been on like a big X-Files kick, so I have just really been in the mood for like police procedurals, kind of, which is not my typical reading. So not even necessarily police procedurals, but like FBI sort of thrillers that have paranormal aspects. I have really been craving reading books, watching media like that. So this one, unlike The Exorcist, where we're really focusing on this family and this demonic possession that is happening, this one we're following a police detective detective as he's trying to solve these crimes, and he starts to think that something more paranormal might be going on, that the perpetrator, this evil perpetrator that has been just committing heinous crimes, may actually be undead or possessed or something going on that is just more supernatural than just the cut and dry serial killer where the monster is a man. So I have definitely been in the mood for this kind of story. In particular, if you have any recommendations, I have read like The Silence of the Lambs, so just know that going in. I have read like Red Dragon and all of that, but if you have any recommendations that are like the X-Files or Longlegs, where we're following an FBI agent, where the antagonists are like supernatural, or it could be also in like the Red Dragon sort of way where we do have our main character who is a man but is like doing like symbology sort of thing. I don't know why this vlog keeps coming back to Dan Brown, but I would love to read a book where it is like Dan Brown, like the Da Vinci Code meets Silence of the Lambs meets like the X-Files. I'd love to read a book like that. So if you have any recommendations, leave them down below. So all of that to say, I'm definitely in the right headspace to read this at the moment, because normally I'm not like drawn to police procedurals. I'm not normally drawn to thrillers or horrors where our main character is a police officer, but this one's like really working. I don't know if it's because I have seen the movie adaptation, so it was easy for me to dive in because I kind of knew what I was dealing with, or if it's because I do know that this is going to deal with demonic possession and like literal demons as opposed to just like a thriller that doesn't have paranormal elements. But I am enjoying this. Unlike the last one, this is like very character driven. Our main character, you get lost in his mind a lot. Kinderman is an older protagonist. He's kind of getting to the end of his career, and he is like musing before these murders even happen why there's so much evil in this world. If there is a higher power, why does so much evil happen? And just like he's very much ruminating on the end of his career, getting towards the end of his life, and just a career that has just been filled with so much tragedy and so much evil. And you get inside his head and read about his ruminations a little bit. So some of those sections could be a little bit of a slog. It's honestly something that I think that the movie does a little bit better of streamlining, but 50% of the way in, this one is definitely one where it's a subject matter that I'm interested in at the moment, so my TBR and my mood reading really colliding. And to read this book, I do wish I cannot find an audiobook for this anywhere. I listened to The Exorcist via audiobook. William Peter Blatty narrates it himself, and that was such an incredible reading experience. I kind of wish I could have done the same for this one, but I am reading it physically. I'm enjoying it so far. I'm at the 50% mark. I'm going to go read the last 50% of this book, and then I'll check back in and let y'all know how I feel about it. Okay friends, so I finished Legion. Safe to say I enjoyed it a lot more than I did the Demonologist, which bodes really well for this vlog. Granted, this was more of a safe bet for me because I've read The Exorcist, loved The Exorcist, and I've seen the movie adaptation of this book and I enjoyed that as well. So I knew going into this, I was familiar with the story, and I kind of knew already that I would enjoy what this book brought to the table. I had a lot of fun. This one is definitely more character driven. I think I mentioned this at the 50% mark, but there is a lot of musings about our main character, Kinderman. Like, we are inside his head a lot of the time, and he is constantly thinking about death and life and the afterlife and the nature of good versus evil. I could see that that could get like a little bit tedious for people because every single chapter that we follow Kinderman, most chapters we follow Kinderman, sometimes in other chapters we go to different points of view and follow them, but every single Kinderman chapter we do have those musings and his point of views and his thoughts about that. So that could get a little tedious, so just know that going in. I definitely think that this feels a little bit different than The Exorcist. This is not The Exorcist redone. It's a very different story. I like that William Peter Blatty didn't just rewrite The Exorcist and just did like a story that focused around an exorcism. Like, this is very different. It's more of like a police procedural, which is really cool. Now, if you are like me and you have seen The Exorcist Exorcist and The Exorcist 3, I still would recommend that you pick this book up. Obviously, like books and movies, they're not completely the same. The movie is a fairly faithful adaptation, but some things are changed around. In particular, there's a character that gets a lot more page time in the book, and I thought this character was super interesting. This character, not giving too much away, does a lot of experiments. He's a man of science, but he's doing a lot of experiments about the afterlife and his takeaways and the things that he is trying to uncover about the afterlife and what happens to us when we die. I thought that was really interesting. That's not really in the movie at all, as well as, even though for the most part the movie is a fairly faithful adaptation of this book, the endings are very different. I think I like the movie's ending a little bit more, which sounds blasphemous to say in a book space because we can all usually agree that the book is better, but I definitely think that the ending, while it does work for the book still, the movie ending is a lot more visual and feels more of like a blockbuster ending, if that makes sense. Like, I think the endings are very different, but it makes sense that one was for the book, one was for the movie, but I really enjoyed it. I know it's fairly non-traditional to do a reading vlog and focus it so primarily on one of the books being a sequel. However, I think if you have read The Exorcist, obviously, you can read this and enjoy it. If you've only seen The Exorcist, I still think you could pick this up and enjoy it. Honestly, really, I don't think that you need to have read The Exorcist. I would say, obviously, be familiar with the story, but I feel like at this point in time, The Exorcist is one of those movies where we all kind of know the main beats of the story, or maybe some character names, where if you are not interested in a very stereotypical priests coming to do an exorcist on a person and you like more of a police procedural and you've maybe just seen The Exorcist, I think you could still pick this book up and have a fun time. Obviously, I would recommend like reading The Exorcist because overall I think it's a better book than this one, but I did have a lot of fun with this. And I do want to reiterate, if you pick up the book The Exorcist, the movie is called The Exorcist. That's fairly simple. There is a movie, The Exorcist 2. I do not like it at all. It is not Legion, so know that going in. Legion is the sequel to The Exorcist, but it's not actually the sequel movie. I really cannot express enough how much I do not like the movie The Exorcist 2, so Legion is actually the movie The Exorcist 3, and I think The Exorcist 3 is a really good movie. So yeah, I overall enjoyed this one. I know it's weird because it technically was not mentioned in the 101 horror books to read before you're murdered book, but The Exorcist was mentioned, and I just wanted this vlog to have more than 2 books in it, but I finally managed to check off another modern horror classic slash backlist book from my TBR. But now we are diving back into Mother Horror's recommendations to read the third and final book in this vlog. And that third and final book is going to be James Newman's The Wicked. The Wicked by James Newman came out in 2007. Mother Horror says the cover of this book is every indication of the horror and madness the Wicked throws down. It is off the rails horror, and I loved every single minute of it. The characters in this small town are fully fleshed out and likable. Katie and David decide to leave the city and move to a small town in North Carolina to raise their young daughter Becca. Everything about Morganville is idyllic. Even their new address on Honeysuckle Lane sounds too good to be true, and it is. An ancient demon was conjured into existence during a horrible tragedy in the town's past. After lying dormant for a season, it's now coming for the souls of the townspeople, especially the children. I am really excited to dive into this one. I love the cover. It just screams like Halloween and like 80s-ish horror with like the illustrated cover. So let's start reading this one. I'm gonna dive into this one and I will check back in at the 50% mark and let y'all know my thoughts about it. Okay, vlog, I am supposed to give a 50% update for this book. I'm giving an 100% update for this book because I did not like this at all. I did not like this. This was probably the worst book that I've read this year. And I know the format of these vlogs is that I give a 50% update and then an 100% update, but I knew at the 50% mark that there was probably nothing else that I could add to the 100% update that would really change my opinion of this book. And I just did not want to draw out the amount of time that I would spend sitting and talking about this book because I did not enjoy it at all. So let's start with the positives for this one. The cover is cool. There's some artwork throughout this book that's also very cool. Like, it's designed to be an 80s pulp horror fiction novel, and it accomplishes that. The cover is amazing. I love how it's actually painted instead of digitally rendered. I think that's really cool. This also takes place in 2002, and the main couple have a daughter who's 7, and in 2002 I was 7, so that's not like really a positive of the book, but it's something cool to see and conceptualize, I guess, because obviously as an adult you want to connect more with the adult characters, but it's also weird to realize that you were a child during the time that this was written. So those are the positives. Let's move on to the negatives. Like I mentioned before, this is written to be an 80s pulp horror novel, and unfortunately it's not an 80s pulp horror novel. Like, it's not like an homage or a tribute or even a satire. Like, it is just written like a lot of them were in the 80s, so there is rampant homophobia and sexism and racism in here that's super hard to read. It doesn't add anything to the story. I hated our main characters. I've mentioned before in this video series that I hate in paranormal horror where we have a family, they move into a haunted house, weird things start happening, and usually the husband is a jerk. This is pretty much boilerplate what happens here. Now, we have our main characters, Kate and David. They used to live in New York City. They are moving to North Carolina with their young daughter to have a brand new fresh start. They need this fresh start because, trigger warning, Kate was sexually assaulted in New York City by a black man. I mentioned that it's a black man because this book is super racist about it. Obviously, he's a bad man because he sexually assaulted Kate, but the way that race is discussed in this book is disgusting. And I'd also like to point out, I've read quite a few books that were written in the 80s throughout my life, but also in particular this summer, that age better than this book does when it comes to that. Not only is Kate sexually assaulted, she finds out after the attack that she is pregnant. Now, her and David were trying for a baby, so they don't know if the baby is David's or the baby is this rapist's. Kate is very religious, and she just feels in her heart, like, obviously it's her body, her choice. She wants to keep this baby no matter what. No matter how it came into the world, she believes that this is her child and she loves it and she wants to raise it to term. David, not on board with the fact. He has a lot of racist rants about how he hopes this baby is not mixed race. That's not the words he used. Really shocking, again, to read that in this book, the words that were used. But David is really convinced that this baby is not actually his, and the feelings that he has towards his unborn child and his wife, and just he's so filled with hate, and he hates that they're moving out of New York City, but they're trying to get a fresh start. Already this couple, even before this tragic event happens, they're not a good match, okay? I don't understand how they're a couple. They seem to really hate each other. Something that I love in horror is when we have a close-knit family that has to get even closer, or maybe they're not even close, but they get closer and try to fight an evil. That's not what's happening here. Kate and David are just constantly at odds with each other. David has this resentment and hatred for his wife and their child. Also, when they move into town, this happens to be the same small town that Kate's brother lives in. Kate's brother is gay, and David is disgusted by this. David is disgusted and doesn't even like being hugged by Kate's brother, which, again, rampant unchecked homophobia. I know small town North Carolina probably was not like San Francisco in 2002, but I think it's such a weird choice to write a book and you're saying you want it to be an 80s pulp horror novel, but you set it in the 2000s, and then it's just just so incredibly bigoted and hurtful, because it's not like these are bad characters saying it or like the antagonists expressing these beliefs. It's our protagonists. It's the people we want to root for, and I just could not even getting into the demonic possession and the creepy supernatural things that happened in this book. David's just a bad father. If you're a woman and you've read this and like David has done anything that your spouse has done, run before you have kids with him, because he is just constantly like, he's just such a toxic man. And I'll give like an example that doesn't have to do with like spoilers for the horror or whatever, but their daughter gets lice. If you've ever had to deal with lice before, you know that it's a big undertaking. Kate at this point in the story is about 8 months pregnant, so she's like very heavily pregnant, and she's taking care of their daughter's hair. They're both taking care of their daughter's hair in the situation in the bathroom. David says he's bored, it's boring, he's going to bed, and just leaves her like to stay up throughout the rest of the night taking care of their daughter. It's just, he is such a neglectful man and husband. And with the way that this ends, which I'm not going to spoil, but with the way that this ends, it's like not gratifying at all, because I hate David. I hate him as a character. And what's frustrating about this one is because I have read a lot of books that have taken place in the 80s. I actually think that Legion came out in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, but I've read a lot of books that have come out in the 80s. I think it's different to realize that, hey, something is a product of its time, and then something was written in the 2000s, like intentionally so to make it worse. I don't know. I don't know what the thought process was here. And in particular, because when I pick up a book from 1980 and I read it, and maybe there's some problematic things in there, I take it as a product of its time. This doesn't have like that same excuse, and it's just, I've read things, like for example, Stranger Things. It's set in the 80s. It still does deal with prejudices, but kind of like more from a modern lens. I'm also thinking of my best friend's Exorcism, came out in the 2000s. It was set in the 80s. I feel like it showcased some of the horrors of its time without like being like an endorsement of them. Same with We Ride Upon Sticks by Quan Berry. That's another one that takes place in the 80s. It's very much a love letter to the 80s, and it deals with racism and homophobia in a very realistic way for the 80s. But it's very clear that it's like, when it's depicting these things, that it's not agreeing with these things, and it's just, I don't know. I just, this was very, very frustrating to read. I thought I would love it. The cover was gorgeous, and this has been on my TBR for a while, and I know a lot of people love this, and maybe you could love this if you aren't queer, or if you aren't a woman who has ever experienced any kind of sexual violence. And again, by the end, I was like, okay, hopefully maybe this is just like a satire that just didn't hit the mark, and it didn't feel like it was satirizing like the bad things that were happening in this book. But there's an acknowledgement and an author's note at the end, and the author says he doesn't consider it to be a parody, spoof, or even tongue-in-cheek, and he says maybe it's a little bit self-aware, not to the extent of something like those Scream movies that refuse to go away. He wanted to have fun with this. Ultimately, he sat down to simply write a story that he would want to read, and it's not what I want to read. It's not what I want to read. So yeah, clearly not the target audience for this book, which I would think that I would be, because I know I've harped a lot about the 80s. This is set in the 2000s, but this is designed to be a book that is like an 80s pulp fiction. So I don't know. I've read 80s pulp fiction, and I didn't feel as viscerally upset and just devalued than I did while reading this book. And what's frustrating is that there were a couple of scenes in here that were creepy. The prologue, for example, really creepy. There's also a scene in here that has to deal with like a book and cutting things out of a book. Like, that's a really creepy scene as well. So there were some cool parts in this. The idea was cool. The execution just, I hated. So unfortunately, we are ending this vlog out on a very bitter note, but that's my review of The Wicked. Clearly, out of the 3 books that I read in this vlog, this one is my least favorite. I don't know who I'd recommend this to, but I just feel so wildly out of the loop, because I was looking through Storygraph reviews and I seem to be in the minority. So I don't know, maybe pick this up. The next one was The Demonologist. This was my middle of the road read. It wasn't like what I typically gravitate towards in horror, but if you like more thrillers and you're looking to get into horror or you like a faster paced, plot driven, over character driven read, I think you could really like this one. And then of course my favorite book in this vlog was Legion by William Peter Blatty. This was all over the place. This was not how I was expecting the demonic possession vlog to go. It's typically a concept that I love to read about in horror fiction and watch in movies, so unfortunately just some of these didn't work for me. But that's okay, I'm still having fun when, you know, I'm looking through and reflecting on all of the books that were in this section. All of them appeal to a very different type of reader, so I think that's more of the lines of what this book is trying to do, is introduce a whole lot of people to a whole lot of horror. So I am excited for the next installment of this series. It'll be coming out next month and we will be reading about witches. But that is gonna be it for this vlog. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like this video, leave a comment down below, let me know your favorite book that has to deal with demonic possession, and maybe I'll do a part 2 to this vlog. Don't forget to subscribe for all of the bookish horror and cozy gaming content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!